Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for us. Maybe that'll inspire Apple to promote us a little in the new year. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSpod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. It was a fun weekend. I had some anxiety, which is always fun for me. It was about the number of guests in the show's immediate future. I've got a bunch of great ones set for late April and May, and there's just kind of a lull in the weeks and month and a half ahead. So I freaked out and kind of worked to wrangle up a bunch of good shows. That is my idea of fun. When somebody writes back and says they'd love to record an episode, and then that means, some sort of approval thing, I guess. In this case, that led to 6 new guests who should come out of this flurry, which does mean I have a ton of reading to do to prepare, but, again, that's fun for me. It certainly beats what I spent today doing, which was writing a section-by-section breakdown of proposed congressional legislation so that a staffer can, quote-unquote, socialize the idea with other congressional offices, or what I spent Friday doing, which was trying to figure out the labyrinth of Health Canada's policymakers for potential meetings up in Ottawa. So yeah, really, don't knock this, okay? In addition to all that, I managed to get out to New York on Saturday. My wife and I went out to the Grolier Club to prepare partly for next week's episode, and also up to the Met, where we got to see the David Hockney exhibition. We managed to get there at, I guess, the right time, because by the time we left the Met, there was a line halfway down the block from the building of people just trying to get in. When we got there, the line was about 10 people long to buy tickets. So I'm sorry, to pay the suggested fee to attend the Met. Anyway, the Hockney exhibition was a blast. I was surprised because I thought I would spend more time grooving on the 1960s and 70s California pool backyard images that he's most renowned for, but it was some of his 80s and really 90s stuff, the weird landscapes in California and that kind of flattened world that he portrayed that I really dug for some reason. I didn't think that was going to happen. Plus a few of the dual people paintings, dual portraits, and a few of the photo collages. It was some really impressive stuff. I'd love to get him on the show someday, but who knows if that's going to happen. Anyway, I also had some anxiety/fun this weekend by reading over some old fiction of mine from like 15 to 20 years ago. I've been doing that a bunch lately because I'm trying to get writing again, and as I start and keep failing, I thought, why don't I look back at my previous failures, and that'll make me feel as though failure is a lifetime project for me. Actually, it's weird because it's been kind of disheartening because there's some prose that I wrote 15 or 20 years ago that's really, really good, and I feel like I can't get there again. The Gil who could write that way was a lot different than this one, even though with all the experience I have now, there's so much more I could get to. But again, maybe I'm just making excuses because, like I said, anxiety equals fun. Now, when I was a little kid, I was, to put it mildly, verbally precocious. My reading and writing skills were just off the charts, as it were. I was no slouch at math and memory activities either. Lucky for me, I never got tagged as a prodigy. That is, I was smart, but not alien smart. And, with puberty, those skills of mine turned into something of a handicap. All of which brings us to this week's episode. Now, our guest is Anne Hulbert, and she's the author of the new book, Off the Charts, The Hidden Lives and Lessons of American Child Prodigies. It's published by Knopf. Anne writes about 15 child prodigies over the last 100 years or so in America. And it covers a gamut of skills, I guess: math, literature, music, dance, programming, and of course, chess in the knockout chapter on Bobby Fischer. The book does this wonderful job of capturing these kids' lives and their relationships to their parents and instructors, and what the cultural moment was for each of them in terms of trying to understand what a child prodigy was, or what education and child rearing was in America in those moments, and how these kids either exemplified it or kind of crushed those notions. She also does a really good job of showing how their later lives help create these sort of object lessons for those of us who weren't prodigies. It's a really enjoyable book, and it's filled with compelling portraits of lives we can't really imagine, because they involve what I will neutrally call a gift. We could load it by saying it's a gift from God, but these kids are gifted in a way that normal kids aren't. But it's a question of how those gifts are inculcated, how they carry through over the course of their lives. She does a really amazing job in this book of drawing that stuff out. Now, I joke a little in the episode about my not being a parent and thus having no stake whatsoever in this whole thing. But reading the book again, it made me wonder, as I always do, what my parents did wrong. I'm just kidding. It makes me think about what I did, how I grew up, how my parents and teachers and the other people in our lives dealt with me, because I was not easy. And that level of precocity that I had could be pretty irritating, I'm sure. I think the best strategy was the one we all kind of emerged into, which was to leave me alone with comic books and hope I didn't get into trouble. Not that I'm a lobbyist, it's hard to say whether I did or didn't get into trouble. But anyway, Off the Charts, Anne Hulbert, illuminating book. I hope it finds a wide audience, especially among parents who legit don't know how to address their kids' precocity, not the parents who are trying to force their kids through some hothouse mentality into being super achievers, although Anne does go into that topic too. But really to help in those instances where, you've got a kid who's clearly got a gift you can't even conceive of. Anyway, it's a really good book. Give it a read. Our only caveats for this one, there's some New York noise, as always happens. Also, Anne's a little quiet in speaking, and she kind of angled away from the microphone on a few occasions, so I amped things up a little bit. It might make for some strange audio artifacts. Sorry. Anne Hulbert is the author of Raising America, Experts, Parents, and a Century of Advice About Children, from 2004. The Interior Castle, The Life and Art of Gene Stafford, from 1992, and Off the Charts. Her articles and reviews have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, and The Atlantic, where she is a literary editor. She is a graduate of Harvard and spent a year at Cambridge University. She lives with her husband, Stefan Sestanovich, in Washington, D.C. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Anne Hulbert. Let's talk about the book.
Yeah.
Where did it begin for you?
This book began, I think, in my previous book, Raising America. And in that book, I had, the fascinating quest of finding out what a succession of 20th century experts, kind of acting very confident and drawing on a lot of shaky evidence, had to say about how we might rear ever more excellent children, generation to generation. And one of the early experts I read about, G. Stanley Hall, actually, I think I'm right, used the word super children. And whatever school these experts belonged to, whether they were kind of the nature over nurture or the nurture over nature guys, they all felt early development of a higher kind than we were currently seeing was essential to the future prospering of a,
you can
more enlightened
race.
human.
Oh,
no,
okay,
not
good.
master race really, but just more enlightened humans. And as I say, it was really fascinating to explore their ideas, their contexts. But I finished the book and I realized, I hadn't really written about children, even though that was the subject that they were all fascinated by. And of course, since I was writing about experts and expertise, I was writing more about theory than about practice. And I was a little frustrated by both. I wanted to write about children, and it seemed to me, though I could write about practice in the sense of writing about their own lives, and I did biographical treatments of the experts, I thought I'd like to put children in the foreground. And it happened that I finished that book at about the time when my own kids were suddenly in the orbit of the college thing. Mm-hmm. And so a greater awareness of this really big cultural obsession with high achievement of a very programmatic sort starting very early was really in my head. And, the race to nowhere, this overscheduled child, the hurried child. And it occurred to me we really do all kind of operate on a proto-prodigy paradigm in a way. And I thought, maybe an interesting way to tackle this would be to look at particular children at particular moments who were examples of what these experts had been saying would be our great goal, these unusual specimens. And started looking into that and found myself completely fascinated, and hence the book.
You profile 15 different, we'll say prodigies, although the savant thing comes up also in one of the chapters. Was there a particular type of prodigy, a particular area of focus that really enthralled you? I mean, you get the mathematical ones, you get the musical ones.
I think part of how I did the book was to try to write about prodigies who stirred up interesting cultural debates. Mm-hmm. So not just that they were really great at what they did, but they were the locus of lots of attention and interest. And that turned out to involve very different kinds of prodigies. So it wasn't that I said to myself, I'm really fascinated in X, so that's the kind of prodigy I'm going to look for my first chapter. It was, there are these prodigies who arrived at Harvard, and they're the ones who are really touching a nerve in an interesting way and kind of making people think about social pressures and social possibilities in a way that they haven't before. So I would say it was not so much my thinking, I need to find a particular type, and am fascinated by it. I would say in the course of working on it, maybe it will seem obvious, but I was particularly interested in the literary girls I write about, partly, I'm sure, because they were probably the closest to home, but also because it's really not what you generally think of as terrain that prodigies excel on. Usually we think prodigies emerge in areas where there are rules and it doesn't require kind of mature experience to be good at whatever the skill is. So math and chess and mastery of an instrument. And poetry and fiction, you'd sort of think that's just not likely to be found in children. So I did find the whole exploration of why they were so in the spotlight, what kinds of worries they tapped into, what kinds of debates they stirred up, and how they did what they did to be kind of particularly fascinating to me.
It was actually interesting because it also overlaps with a book I did a couple of years ago, The Witch of Lime Street, about Houdini's attempting to debunk a medium back in the post-World War I era, because there is a point at which
Right.
they start to think maybe these girls are channeling.
Right.
Which,
Right.
I was like, oh, this is what David Jayer wrote about a couple of
Right.
years ago, that cultural moment of,
Right.
of the medium.
Yeah.
Were you happy not to have been a genius / prodigy? And I'm assuming you were not growing up, because
Yes, yes.
you're much better adjusted than most of the genii I've known.
Now that I know what I know, or I mean, it's not as though it really ever crossed my mind to think, am I glad that I wasn't a prodigy? But yes, I would say from everything I've learned, amazing and exhilarating it is, and sort of, really awe-inspiring to see children who are able to do things that we don't think children can do. I think it's a really hard life, even if it's a very fruitful and creative and rewarding life. And I think I wouldn't say, and I hope the book doesn't absolutely rule out the notion that, you could be a child prodigy who ended up feeling very happy that you had been one. And in fact, interestingly, I think even those who have gone through phases of feeling that it was really an ordeal, I think have a hard time later on saying, God, I wish I weren't.
Mm-hmm. They just sort of...
it's like you just don't want to say you wish your childhood hadn't been your childhood. But
right. Which enough people do.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. And I guess I would also, just to get even more specific, the notion of pursuing something without an expectation of being really good at it seems to me was actually one of the pleasures of my childhood. I did study piano, but I was never good. It was always obvious I had no natural talent, but I really, it didn't keep me from not enjoying it and having it ultimately be just sort of an important part of my life, though I'm really and truly not a good pianist at all. So,
I don't know if you can boil down the lesson, I suppose, if there is, a lesson of the book. You mentioned, I think in the introduction, that the primary lesson that the children themselves seem to repeat again and again seems to be back off, that, maybe the parental pressure and the expectations are too great. Did you find a real common thread like that? Something that you could actually apply, not simply to upbringing of these prodigies, but
I do think that there's a lot about sort of the prodigy experience that sort of shows us writ large things about childhood and its place in a trajectory of a life that seem to me ones that all of us with ordinary children can, learn from. I think it tells you some things about child development that are useful to have brought into really clear relief. And oddly, one of them, I think, is that prodigies are incredibly good, fast learners at something, but they also kind of remind you that all children are, when you stop and think about it, it's amazing what
how
they
much
learn.
they have to, yeah.
And just to sort of have that called to one's attention seems to me, as for those of us who are parents, like that is itself a really, genuinely useful thing. I think the ways in which the prodigies remind you also of the thing that children do with things they're interested in that are not what adults do, which is that they just get absorbed in it for its own sake, rather than thinking, I'm doing this now so that I will be a genius in the future. That seems to me also something very useful for parents to think about. We do, in our culture that's sort of obsessed with the importance of the early years, tend to have a hard time thinking about that in any other way than, and we have to think immediately to what adulthood, how are we going to make, and what's the future going to be, and what. Whereas if you actually can just think about it as something about childhood. Childhood is something you only have once. It's actually pretty short in the compass of a whole life. That seemed to me also very useful. And prodigies really do make that vivid in a way that I think we can use to see. You know, it's sort of, you don't always pay attention to that. I do think the ways in which every child prodigy ends up with a kind of adolescent crisis. Again, that's not new. We all know that adolescence can be rocky, but I do think the ways in which, for Prodigy, it becomes so clearly about figuring out why they do what they do and how they're doing it, and being sort of self-aware in a new way about what their identity is and how much autonomy they've had so far, and whether and how they want to continue, seems to me, again, worth having in mind as a parent as your child unfolds, that there's going to be that moment. And it's not just, oh God, I'm going to face a teenager. It's that there's a whole lot of really interesting identity and, you know, self-aware work going on that we should help. This sounds too instrumental to sort of help prepare for, but you want to have a child who is autonomous and ready for that when that time comes. So I thought that's also a useful thing to remember. And those are all about sort of how children work. And I do think they have corollaries for how parents should be parents, which are, I mean, the main one really is, and I don't mean to make this sound easy, but
I have no kids, so I'm just going to take up whatever you say and say, well, she must be right.
Yeah, that it's, you know, the back off thing is, in a way trying to say, it's so easy as a parent to start projecting onto your child your own hopes, your own anxieties, your own ambitions, even when you think you're not. I mean, it's a kind of, I'm sure there's some evolutionary reason we do this, and I think to some degree it's unavoidable, and it's not like a parent will be able to overcome that. But I do think working at getting beyond that to actually see your kid as a person independent of you with his or her own, you know, ways of going about things and thinking about things, and trying to do everything you can to let them be that, seemed to me probably the main takeaway. And that does go along with feeling, and I think you made this point, the power of expectations is a really tricky thing. Mm-hmm. And I think having super high ones can be an entrapment for a kid. Obviously, having low ones is no gift to anyone either. But I think, you know, being aware of how much they influence children in ways that we have a hard time telling seems to me something every parent should have in mind.
And now for the big personal question. How did the previous book and this book impact how you were rearing your kids? Are there things you look back at and think, geez, well, at least it didn't turn out like Bobby Fischer? Or, you know, are there...
Well, I think that Raising America is a kind of skeptical book in a way. Mm-hmm. That is, it was born out of feeling here we're this generation of parents that is completely inundated with advice, where our parents basically listened to Dr. Spock and were told, not successfully really, that you know more than you think you know. So I think I was not actually a parent who was poring over all these books until I became a writer who was writing about these books. But I think that weirdly the lesson I took from that one was the opposite of what experts tend to tell you, which is experts are always saying you just have to find the expert who feels right to you and is on your wavelength, and then you just do whatever they tell you to do. And I actually ended up thinking that, for me anyway, the opposite was helpful, which is I learned much more from the experts with whom I did not agree, and learned things in a way that I think is useful for parents to learn them, which is I didn't feel enthralled to this expert. I didn't think, oh, now that I've learned this, I must apply it, or if I don't, I should feel guilty about not, or all of which are ways I think parents respond to experts whom they swear by. So to sort of go a little bit against your own grain seems to me is not a bad thing to do as a parent. And if you're, you know, kind of the touchy-feely bonding kind of parent, which I definitely was, to get a little bit of tough talk from the tougher parenting, I found genuinely useful. Not that I applied it.
That's what I'm wondering. If there were
did
things...
I really apply it? I mean, in a way, I think I did get a little better at just sort of laying down a law and not feeling particularly like I needed to have a lot of endorsement of it from my own kids. And I was lucky in having kids who didn't, in the range of challenges presented by children, I think mine were easy.
Mm-hmm. If they were sitting in the room right now, would they have the same general set of comments? Or
as young kids, yeah, I think they would.
Okay.
I think they probably would.
Mm-hmm. And lessons born from working on this one?
I do feel, my kids went to a, very highly regarded school that was very pedagogically correct in its treatment of young kids. It was a very progressive lower school, and I do think my kids got, the chance to explore. There was not a lot of drilling. There was not a lot of, sort of super structured, achievement-oriented stuff of a sort that I think since they were kids has become much more of the No Child Left Behind staple of a lot of, test-oriented curriculum. And I feel very lucky that was the case. They then also did have super, competitive, everybody should go to a good college ethos as they got older. And much as I felt that I didn't like the ethos and wanted to push against it, and it's amazing how one does get caught
pressure.
up in it. Yeah. And I do feel as though, it's not as though I had kids who I had to drum this into them. And so I feel like I was an awful, complicit, competitive horror, but I didn't push back. Mm-hmm. I really didn't.
See, I lucked out. My father was a dropout in the Israeli army, so they got to America, no idea what college was. So,
that's the way to go.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I ended up at Hampshire, but
could be okay.
That's a long-going thread on the show. I did go to St. John's College afterwards for a 2-year program as an antidote, but
that is about as
opposite as you can get.
The other end of the spectrum as one can go.
It was pretty remarkable in terms of trying to balance those things out, which again may be why I do this in addition to a day job. One of the odd threads, or something that comes up very late in a chapter in the book that I wondered if it led you down any sort of rabbit hole or if you had to resist. One of the two girl writers you bring up, Barbara Follett, disappeared at the age of 25. And did you find yourself having any sort of, should I look into what happened there and whether that led to a bigger story than is not being told?
Was there.
Yeah. Because, of course, I started looking it up immediately after finishing that chapter.
Well, and there is a new book.
Yes,
that I will steer you to, a memoir that involves a person who goes and tries to find out what happened to Barbara. And I will not do the spoiler.
No, because I got to get this person on the show if there's a story there. But
I did. I mean, I was utterly fascinated. I have to say that given the scope of what I was trying to do, knowing what it would take, and now I am confirmed, having read what this other writer went and did, I would never.
You would have gone Zodiac on it, and
I would never have, and I think
that
my instinct that it was fruitless was I think not incorrect.
Okay.
So, but yes, it is utterly haunting, and
Of all the prodigies you profile throughout the book, it would seem that the ones who I don't want to say were the most adjusted, but the ones who at least pursued an arc that they were able to continue from prodigy status through adulthood seems to be the programmers, the Bill Gates, the Jobs, the two East Coast guys. Did you draw anything out of that in terms of either the area in which they were focused and the fact that it was a wide open frontier, Or just that, there was how much of a luck factor, I guess, is carried throughout any of these guys' lives or these people's lives, that they happen to end up in a circumstance that they could continue pursuing and not fall to earth, I suppose.
Well, I think if you think a little beyond that in the book, I mean, Norbert Wiener, who you could say is the precursor or something,
Certainly.
and that's probably not a bad way to think about him.
It does have a decline, or at least has more difficulty.
But he absolutely proceeds and becomes, I think hugely influential. And if you're wondering about the connection between sort of early, remarkable achievement and a sort of real creative insight, he definitely is an example of that. Henry Cowell, who is a musician, a composer who ends up, again, a very rocky, difficult life, which I think is another good thing that prodigy lives tell you. Even the most creative and successful, that doesn't mean smooth and unshadowed at all. But I think, I do think in both of those cases and in the computer case, absolutely, your cultural moment is crucial, and that's part of the points I hope emerge from every chapter. That when the fact that Norbert Wiener was looking for a job at a time when his specialties could help the wartime effort, that after the war there was this big technological push, and MIT was MIT, and all of that, I think, made a huge difference. And you do find yourself playing the game of, well, what if, and who knows? And that's certainly the case with the computer prodigies, that, the convergence of the moment and this particular kind of mind and this particular pursuit is obviously, made a huge difference. When you think of acting and being a child actor, obviously the end of that is clearly going to be in sight. And I think what's puzzled many people, or puzzled in a way it shouldn't be puzzling, but the notion that literary talent, early signs are not remote. Many people who ended up being really great writers were also quite unusual as children, but many unusual children don't end up being great writers. And I think that's, in a way, the main lesson about when we think about prodigies is it's surprising how often it is true when you've got a great musician or something and you look back and they are remarkably accomplished, remarkably early. The inverse is not true. Many who are very remarkably accolished don't end up.
Yeah, they have to put in the hours and
then they have to
life.
Have to have many. You asked about luck. I think you cannot underestimate how much good and bad luck and who and what happens when end up making really disproportionate differences that you couldn't possibly predict when a child is 8 or something.
So, since I'm never going to be a parent, would it be safe to say then that it's pretty much, you're on your own?
You mean, is there a formula for if you have a prodigy seeing to
even a regular kid at this
yeah.
point, making sure they don't end up like me is really important.
Right. No, I do think in general, to add one more lesson that prodigies' stories seem to me to bequeath is that it's amazing how many twists and turns lives take from childhoods that may seem to augur something. And to be reminded of that fact seems to me is a useful one. Yeah, I do think giving children who are remarkably curious and experimental and fast learning creatures every opportunity you can, it seems to me a great thing to do. And to not do that, I think, if that's what you meant by just throwing up your hands, I think that's not a gift to a child. And I think trying to be the parent who, while being there to help the kid do what the child most wants to do is a really important thing to do. Also, being really aware of how much you also don't want to dominate the foreground and be too coercive a guide, or too solicitous a guide either. It seems to me that's probably pretty good advice.
Now, did your own parents resent the fact that you were looking into child rearing as a subject of your books? Do they take that as a, where did we go wrong? Is she criticizing us? Or
No, I mean, my mother, who is dead, was a teacher, and she wasn't a teacher her whole life, but she was a teacher before she had kids, and then she was a teacher after we were grown. And she and I spent, even when I was I was reading books about children and education when I was a child, and talking a lot with her about it. And she actually had a friend who had a daughter who was a really unusual child, and they exchanged a whole lot of letters, and my mother would always send me those letters. So I think she very much shared this interest in children's potential and what it is and could be. And my father, and I don't think he would mind my saying this, who is alive, used to like to say, and still does with a slightly more jovial tone in his voice, that he liked to subscribe to the view that children were guests in the house. And he would do this in a way that the tone was kind of like, I'm that sort of 19th century father, but which of course he wasn't really. But I do think his view that in a way the job of parents is to have more detachment than certainly he feels my generation comes by naturally with our children. He thinks that that is a parental role that is important, the detachment part of it. And I do think that has had an influence on my thinking about this. And I think he was himself, tried out to be on the Quiz Kids show. So he was an unusual child himself. So I think he's kind of interested in the whole question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I was growing up, that was also part of the scene. In my school, at least, it was known as the Gifted and Talented, or G&T program, which obviously, G&T took on a much different meaning for me in my later days. But I'm just kidding. But that's
Gin and tonic.
And it was a much more entertaining version too. But
right.
Are you hearing it all from Prodigy parents? I know the book is just coming out, but there have been a few excerpts. Has there been any? Okay, I wasn't sure if there's.
Yeah, no, I'll be interested to know. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about your own literary upbringing and your upbringing in general. I suppose, but you're a smart person who reads books, and to me, that's not something that people come to late in life. What was the literary childhood for you?
For me,
Yeah,
I was an early reader and a bookworm, and did spend as much time as I could. There weren't so many other things to do when we were growing up.
Grow up?
But I read all the time and loved to read all the time. And I did have a phase when I had a pen name, and I wrote stories about horses and things like that. So I think I would say very early that was what I was most interested in. I went to a very experimental school starting in 5th grade, right when it had been founded. The sort of founding premise of which was, children can do amazing things, and we're going to have this school where it was very progressive in its view. We want children to pursue their interests at whatever pace they want. When I was 11, the star in my math class was a kindergartner. And that was part of the idea of the school. It worked that way. We didn't actually have grades, the first grade, second grade. And so you did what you did, not based on your age. And we didn't have letter grades or anything like that either. And I suppose that this was a time of pedagogical ferment in general, I think.
Again, Hampshire graduate.
Right,
Yeah.
right, and it was exactly.
I felt
we
18.
we sent lots of kids. My school went to Hampshire.
It was probably Hampshire, Evergreen, Oberlin, and I forget what the fourth school is. Bard.
Wesleyan at
Oh,
one
okay.
point, yeah.
Yeah, because those
but
are usually
Bard,
the
yeah.
ones.
Bard,
that
I think
you
at
know.
that point wasn't so much, but yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that's.
No, those things are interesting to me to see what the pursuits were and you know, basically where I went wrong. That's really what the show is all about.
What should I have done?
Why did I go in this direction? You know. But do you remember making that choice of, you know, I'm going to try and make a living writing?
I don't make a living writing.
Okay.
I'm an editor.
Well, yeah, you make a living within the literary world.
This is a very important distinction.
Yes, certainly. But that you pursue.
What I pursue?
Yeah.
Yes and no. I mean, I graduated from college. You know, I was what was called a history and literature major. So I'm basically an English major, but I did a lot of history too. And I sort of knew I didn't want to be a graduate student in English, though I went for some graduate school at Cambridge in England, and I actually loved it. But at that point, it was theory, and I just really, that was not what I wanted to do. And I dabbled in sort of literary magazine at college. And I really feel like I'm a good example of sort of luck. That is, I didn't get a job at the New Republic and then was kind of asked to come back and be a summer intern right out of college. And then my hat was in the ring, sort of, and this possibility presented itself, and I seized it. And then another opening happened that one could never have predicted, being the literary assistant to a brand new literary editor at the magazine, who himself was a former truck driver, a real autodidact, amazing man. And we sort of got to do this together, and it was really an amazing immersion in what I think, if you'd asked me to sketch what I would most like to do, it would have been assign and edit and think about covering books and what they say about the world in a magazine like the New Republic. But
had you known such a job existed? Exactly?
Well, I did, in the sense that that's what I applied for when I got out of college, and I didn't get the first time. But
you got to shape the job in the process.
I got in the end. I did get it. So I guess. But looking back, I think that makes it sound more purposeful than it was. It felt to me like being in the right place at the right time.
Oh, I had career by attrition for the longest time. People kept quitting or dying ahead of me, and nobody suspected. I mean, I kept getting moved ahead on these things. Right. How's that job changed? I mean, I know you've gone to multiple magazines.
You mean being a literary editor?
Yeah. It's been...
Well, I mean, I've now, I guess, kind of bridged the great transformation, but sort of arrived back.
You were digital only once upon.
I was at Slate. After I left the New Republic, I did some editing and writing for Slate, and that was at the very beginning of the online, magazine world. And there, I think actually the kind of things I was doing as an editor were not as different from what had done at the New Republic as you might think. It wasn't blogging. I was assigning pieces. I was editing them. I was, working on them and making writers rewrite them. And so many of the elements of the old print world were still in operation. And I felt really lucky about that, because that's what I like to do. And now at The Atlantic, I'm at the magazine, which is a monthly. And we really do, we are even a slower metabolism way slower than I was back at the New Republic when I first started. And that means, intensive editing of a even greater sort, and careful copy editing and fact checking. It's about as old fashioned as you could possibly get, I think, at this point.
Writer you regret you didn't get to work with?
Oh, there are so many writers that I haven't worked with.
I mean, ones who are dead, so that you could feel safer in saying that, I really wish I got to work with X before they were gone. So.
That's an interesting question. I'm always bad at these.
I have a whole list of guests who I've wanted to get who died on me.
Yeah.
David Carr, James Salter, guys like that.
Yeah. Doing the kind of literary critical stuff that, God, that is really, what does it say that I have not really said to myself, boy, if only
I could assign
Lionel Trilling had been there, or I could have gotten, here's one that I will say. She is now gone, but I actually got to know her a little bit, and I really wish I'd gotten Lizzie Hardwick to write more for me. She was busy writing for the New York Review, but I have wondered in retrospect, well, what if I had just said, can't you make them let you do something for me instead, whether she would have. I'm just thinking of sort of critics of the, I would have, I don't know. That's a very interesting question, I would have loved to edit a Virginia Woolf piece. Yeah. I mean, that would
as far as literary idols go. Yeah.
Yeah, that would have been, I would have loved to edit one of E.M. Forster's essays. You know what I mean? I can, yeah.
Do you have a literary celebrity freakout moments at all? Or are there writers you've met who you've kind of, holy crap, I'm talking to X, Y, or Z, or you're pretty much over, I assume nowadays you've had enough exposure to people that, you realize they're all Joe, but do you remember ever getting tongue-tied around a literary figure?
One of the blessings, I like to think of it, of having done what I do, always living in Washington, is that, honestly, I don't have to navigate the world of
being
parties
here at the Random House offices.
I mean, I get invitations to things often in my role as literary editor, but I honestly always have to say, well, I'm not going to be in New York for that. And I'm not sorry about that. And so I'd like to make you think that I'm, always wheeling and dealing with celebrity literary figures. I'm really not. And of the ones whom, and I'm trying even to search my mind for ones that would qualify in your estimation as, I guess I would have to say I don't have some mortifying memory of, oh my God, how did I not do X or Y?
Yeah, I did have the embarrassing moment of being on the Acela a few weeks ago and not realizing that the woman sitting next to me was Senator Gillibrand.
Yes.
Just because half of the New Jersey delegation from the House was in that particular car, and she was helping me identify people, and I'm like, and you are? She's like, Senator Gillibrand. I'm like, I was thinking New Jersey, not New York. I'm so sorry. And because my day job involves lobbying, so that made it particularly embarrassing.
Yeah.
But I don't get tongue-tied around people because, again, they're all,
you have to do what you
they're all. Did being in Washington, do you feel that being in Washington either hampered or how did it affect pursuing the career that you have pursued, not being New York, not being part of literary circles here?
I actually think it has been, for me, a boon in pretty much every way. I think I didn't have that sense as I was rising in my career of, what's happening with all the other young writer/editor types who are trying to make their way. I kind of felt, well, here I am at the New Republic and I'm doing what I'm doing. And I had, it's not as though the New Republic there isn't a circle in Washington.
Sure. Yeah.
But it just, the cachet in the town has nothing to do with,
the values.
Little to do with, yes. And which is not to say that people aren't interested. So you sort of get the best of both worlds. People do want an antidote to, politics all the time. And yet you also feel like you don't have a constituency you're worrying about pleasing or displeasing. I have been remarkably blind to questions of like, well, do I need to be making sure that I've got books from this publisher or that publisher? I don't think about it. And I think I probably would if I were more in the midst of things. And I think all in all, for an editor, it's good not to feel that kind of
I say chumminess, but
not chummy. That I don't even mean, because I'm sure I would love aspects of it, but I think just sort of for what you do, it's, as an editor, I think it's easier to have distance.
Have reader expectations changed or affected what you do?
Well,
beyond just the shift to online thing, have there been?
Well, I do think I'm always thinking, since quite a bit of what I do as a literary editor is think about writing about books, is on the one hand, now you can go lots of places and get sort of different takes on a book. On the other hand, there are fewer places that actually have book reviews in the old sense of like a paper or newspaper that has a book review. And on the other hand, there are many websites that run really interesting essayistic literary work for an audience that has to know where to find it. So I guess I feel the pressure at The Atlantic anyway to try to be doing what I'm doing with a view to being part of a larger conversation when I'm choosing what I'm going to cover and who I'm choosing to cover it. And it feels like that's terrain that is shared a little less widely than used to be the case. Mm-hmm. And that at the same time, trying to make it a little broader than a sense of this is a review is an important thing when you can go find assessments all over the place of any particular book. So.
But you're not planning the Ron Charles pivot to video, like at the Washington Post, where he does those goofy
videos. Yeah. Well,
which I give him credit for, because you have to sell it. So.
Yeah. Well, and the Atlantic does do videos. We have not really branched out that much into videos related to the literary stuff we do in the magazine. And I've become a huge podcast fan, so I do think there are now so many of them, and they're so good. I don't know that there's, huge landscape there in need of planting, but I do think it's a medium that
I can show you how to set all this stuff up. This is relatively.
You've made it look like you can carry it.
I come down to DC for the day job periodically. I even offered to do this down there, but they said no. We'd rather you do it up here in the office because, they got those cameras that are watching. I'm just kidding. They're not actually. I hope.
No, they've got a mic.
Yeah, sure. They might be keeping an eye on us, but it's a few weeks ago. I was in the Vanity Fair offices, and I'm pretty sure they were. Who's that schlub from New Jersey walking through? But so the question I keep coming back to with the Prodigy book is the question of that the subject that these children at the time were focusing on, and whether the subject is an end in and of itself, or whether there's something to be gained from, okay, they're super focusing on X, but they'll learn how to, expand it. And I mean, again, in the Bobby Fischer chapter, which I always come back to, partly because you cited my favorite novella of all time by Stefan Zweig in it, there's nothing applicable from his focus on chess, the way it's portrayed in the chapter. That does not turn into, he was going to be good at math and this, that, or the other in school. It was really, once he latched onto that subject, it became the be-all and end-all. Was there that sense of, again, I guess trying to figure out whether there was an extrapolation that, what they do could somehow turn into a fuller life?
Yeah. Well, I do think Bobby Fischer is sort of the extreme example of, talent development as monomania and possibly, that there's often something somewhat compensatory at work, probably in a really intense focus. And he had a lonely, somewhat chaotic life, and you can sort of understand the allure of something like chess as a way to deal with that life. I think, there's a whole literature about the relationship between chess and madness, but I don't think you need to even sort of come out one way or the other on that to see the ways in which, for him, what in its odd way was kind of adaptable or adaptive as a child really drew on all the qualities that worked against him assimilating into normal life later. And I think you don't find a story quite like that elsewhere in the book, unless it's the William James Sidis, one of the math prodigies at the turn of the century. And even he actually was a very eclectic mind and was interested in all kinds of things. I think socially he really was cut off and uninterested in other human beings. And I think that's really too sweeping to say. He fell in love with someone. He was obviously interested in human beings, but had a very difficult time relating to human beings. And I think if that becomes something that doesn't get addressed or paid attention to because there is something else you're pursuing and everybody is attentive to it, I do think it will take a toll. And I think you can see that in different ways in all the stories. But, Shirley Temple's sort of managerial chutzpah from the day she was, walked onto the Fox lot, that is a steady, that's not her talent, but in a way it is weirdly her talent.
Yeah.
And that ends up, whatever you think of her as a diplomat later, it definitely led her to succeed in, the rest of her life. I think Natalia Crane, the poet who never really became a great poet, nonetheless was a sort of adventurous soul who had been encouraged to pursue something that, even though probably the fame and attention wasn't the best, didn't end up skewing her life greatly, and even though she was not a great poet in the end. Is that answering
sort
your
of?
question?
I guess it's around that
yeah.
question of the monomania that tends to go into being a prodigy and whether it can flower into a more complete life, and whether there was a common element to any of them who managed to do that, or if once again it's case by case, the gestalt of the parenting, the luck, the subject that they happen to focus on, the period in history.
Yeah, I do think lots of those things go into each of the stories, so that coming out with a sort of crystalline, this is the clue to it all is difficult. I guess I would say that, to touch on several things we've talked about, I think when you're given the expectation that you are truly unusual and bound for something unusual, which, by the way, not every product, Norbert Wiener's father was desperate not to have his son think that, but for good and for ill. I think it probably does kind of lead you not to take the view that your talent is a way into a world of other people, and that the way that talent may unfold will depend on others in a very important way, that there can be, in the notion of a kind of early genius, a sense of an enclosed notion of what that is. And I think increasingly, particularly in computing, for example, and in math, now I know this is true, there's a reason we don't single out single great contributors to something. It's because now huge breakthroughs tend to be collaborative things. You need to know how to do that. You need to be interested in doing that. And I think some of what historically has been associated with early childhood mastery doesn't lead you to be good at that.
So last question, easy one. Nature or nurture?
Well, I really do think, I hope the book ends up leaving you thinking, in a way, it's not really even the interesting question, and there's obviously no separating the two. And even trying to kind of side with one or the other more or less seems to me probably not that useful.
Did you find that opinion changing at all? Did you
Did
come
I go
into
in
it with a
one?
preconception?
No, I really didn't. And I guess I do feel that I came out of it more aware of whatever the contributions of nature, and I definitely believe there are contributions of nature. The whole idea, which I think is associated with the prodigy, of somehow there being something spontaneous and effortless about the emergence of a talent, and that it's really just happens and it's amazing and wondrous. I think that misses something essential, which is no matter what you come to, whatever it is that you end up being really good at with, I think it does take just kind of a lot of work and time to end up being a really extraordinary exemplar of anything. And how the interplay between loving what you're doing because it is the thing that you were made to do, and how much making real progress at that is so rewarding that you keep trying to make progress at it, and how much, I think this is Gary Kasparov said about Bobby Fischer, his utter indefatigability. He was willing to spend hours and hours and hours studying the history of chess, and he memorized immense numbers of moves. That itself was sort of essential to his gift. And we don't tend to think of that when you think of prodigious talent, but I think that sort of ingredient, and I don't know if that's nature or nurture either.
And how much goes into just trying to become a decent human being?
Right. All that too. I mean, lots goes into being a decent human being, not necessarily very codifiable. And, you don't, insofar as parents are kind of thinking they're looking for progress at every step, it's also a little hard to, in childhood, say, well, becoming more decent every day. I hope what doesn't get lost is what children can do is really kind of amazing. And though it is a very fraught subject that gets everybody debating about things, I also kind of want to put a word in for, trying, which is the other thing I really did set out to do in this book, trying as hard as I could to get their view of all of this was, in a way, one of the most interesting challenges for me in working on the book. And it's not easy because children don't leave records, really.
Or they're trying to please the parents in how they represent it. And Hulbert, good luck with the book, and thanks so much for coming on the Virtual Memories Show.
Thank you so much.
And that was Ann Hulbert. Her new book is Off the Charts, The Hidden Lives and Lessons of American Child Prodigies, from Knopf. It's in better bookstores, and even if you're not a parent or if your kid's a knucklehead, you should still give it a read. It's an amazing and illuminating book. Now, Ann doesn't have a website, near as I can tell, but she's on Twitter as Ann Hulbert1. That's ANNHULBERT and the number 1. She's a literary editor at the Atlantic Monthly, so you can look up her byline on their site to see more of her writing. Now, once we wrapped up the main session, I asked Ann, so, who are you reading? If you want to get her answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The newest episode of that one just went up this week, and it features new material from Shannon Wheeler, Barry Blitt, Martin Rosen, Nicholas Delbanco, Eshkol Nevo, Eddie Portnoy, Vanda Kreft, and Cullen Murphy. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via Patreon at patreon.com/VMSpod or at paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my new secret project that gets me more nervous every day, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode as part of back-to-back sessions in New York City, along with last week's show with John Leland. It was the usual $12 at the GW, $30 for parking, $6 for Subway, plus coffee and pastry at Dean and DeLuca outside the New York Times offices before I talked to John, blah, blah, blah. If you want to help, and that means defraying some of the costs of this show, including web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee and pastry, or if you just want to toss me some money because you think this whole project is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, Joe Caruso, Paul Karasik, and Michael Janizik for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We've got the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with, I hope, Henry Wessels, an antiquarian book dealer and the curator of a new exhibition on the history of science fiction at the Grolier Club in New York City. The book that accompanies the exhibition is a blast. It's called A Conversation Larger Than the Universe. Not on Amazon. You got to go to the Grolier Club website to order it. We haven't recorded yet, so if we don't connect this weekend, then I will post the long-awaited episode with Levi Tadar instead. Till then, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or the more comprehensive chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes Store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave us a rating and review. That'll help us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.